Imagine waking up before the sun has risen. The room around you is pitch black, and the cold, a deep, bone-penetrating cold, has already crept beneath the thin woolen blanket you share with two of your siblings. The air smells of coal smoke, damp plaster, and something else, something you can't quite name at first. Then it comes to you. It is the smell of the privy in the backyard, wafting through the cracked window frame that no one has ever properly sealed. You are not in a dungeon. You are not in a workhouse. You are in a perfectly ordinary working-class home in Birmingham, England, in the year 1880, and this is simply Tuesday morning. You swing your legs off the straw mattress, shared, as mentioned, with your siblings, and your bare feet touch a flagstone floor so cold it sends a shock straight up through your spine. There is no central heating. There is no running hot water. There is, in the kitchen below, a coal-burning range that your mother has already risen to light in the dark, because if she does not, there will be no warm food, no hot water for washing, no warmth of any kind for a family of 7. She has been up since 5:30. She will not sit down again until 10 o'clock at night. This is Victorian England. Not the Victorian England of Jane Austen adaptations, of candlelit drawing rooms and witty repartee, of lace gloves and garden parties. This is the real thing. Gritty, exhausting, often brutal, always unrelenting. And today, we are going inside it. Before we go any further into this world, before we step through that door and smell the coal smoke and the boiled cabbage and the particular staleness of a house that has never been properly ventilated, I want to take just a moment to speak to you directly. If you're here for stories like this, honest, deeply researched, immersive journeys into the past, then this channel was made for you. History isn't just dates and monarchs, it's people. It's kitchens and back alleys and sleeping arrangements that would horrify a modern health inspector. It's the extraordinary courage of ordinary lives. Every video we make takes weeks of research, and every one of them exists because of people who choose to subscribe and support this community. If you haven't yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Now, let's go back. Let's go back to 1880. The door in front of you belongs to a terraced house on a narrow cobblestone street in the industrial Midlands. It is not a slum, not quite, though the distinction between working-class respectability and outright destitution in 1880 is thinner than you might imagine, and a single illness, a single week without work, can collapse that distinction entirely. The house is 2 stories tall, built of brick that was once red but has been blackened over the years by coal smoke until it is closer to the color of old charcoal. The windows are small because glass is expensive, and window tax, though abolished in 1851, shaped the architecture of a generation, and builders kept the habit of minimizing glass long after the law changed. The front step has been scrubbed this morning. That scrubbed front step is important. It is one of the few ways a working-class woman in 1880 can signal to her neighbors that she keeps a decent house, that she has not given up, that her family, however stretched, still maintains standards. The step is a form of social armor. You push open the door and step into the front parlor. This room is, in a very real sense, a lie. It is the best room in the house, kept for visitors and Sunday afternoons, and it contains the family's finest possessions arranged with careful deliberation. A horsehair sofa that is deeply uncomfortable to sit on, a small side table with a crocheted cover, a framed print of a biblical scene on the wall, a few ornamental pieces on the mantelpiece, a china dog, a small clock that may or may not still be working. The fireplace here is unlit. The coal to heat this room is a luxury that cannot be afforded every day. The parlor's purpose is performance. It tells any visitor that the family living here is respectable, God-fearing, and possessed of good taste. It is kept so rarely used that it has a particular smell, the damp, closed room smell of a space that receives no daily warmth. In winter, there may be a thin layer of condensation on the inside of the window pane. In summer, it is the coolest room in the house. No one actually wants to spend time here, but everyone wants guests to see it. Move through to the back of the house and you find the room where the family actually lives, the kitchen. This is everything the parlor is not. It is warm, sometimes overwhelmingly so in summer, from the cast iron range that runs almost constantly. The walls are close, the ceiling is low. The table in the center is scarred with years of use, its surface stained with grease and scrubbed white in patches where someone has attacked it with a brush. There are hooks on the walls for pots and utensils. There is a dresser along one wall displaying the everyday crockery, thick, plain, slightly chipped. On the range, a pot of something is almost always simmering. Today, it is a gray, porridgey substance made from oats and water, and not much else. The range itself deserves a moment of your attention, because it is the technological heart of this household, and it demands constant, exhausting management. It is fueled by coal, which must be purchased, carried in, and carefully rationed. It must be cleaned every single morning, the flues cleared, the ash removed, the iron blacked with a paste to prevent rust, before it can be lit. Lighting it takes skill and patience. It has no thermostat, no dial, no automatic function of any kind. Knowing when the oven is hot enough to bake bread is a matter of instinct developed over years. You hold your hand near the opening, you learn by feel and experience what each temperature means. The woman who runs this range runs the household, and the knowledge she carries in her hands and body is profound and almost entirely unacknowledged by the world beyond these walls. There is no indoor bathroom. There is a copper, a large, round vessel built into the corner of the scullery at the back for heating water for washing. The water itself must be carried in from an outdoor tap or a communal pump in the street, depending on the neighborhood. Some houses in 1880 do have indoor cold water supply from the municipal mains, but hot water from a tap is still a distant dream for working-class families. Every jug of warm water in this house has been heated by someone's labor. The privy, the toilet, is in the yard at the back. It is a wooden seat over a cesspit, shared in many cases with the neighboring household. It is not a water closet. The Great Stink of London in 1858 had already spurred some municipalities to take sewage infrastructure seriously, and by 1880 urban sewage systems were being extended, but progress was uneven and slow. In many working-class streets, the privy is still just what it sounds like, a wooden shed over a hole. You do not want to use it in January at 2 in the morning, but sometimes you have no choice. Upstairs, the house has 2 bedrooms. In the main bedroom, the parents sleep in an iron bedstead with a horsehair mattress and a bolster pillow. The mattress, if the family is fortunate, has been purchased relatively recently and is tolerably clean. If not, it may harbor, and here we must be direct, because the Victorians were not squeamish about this even if we are, fleas, bedbugs, and lice. These were facts of ordinary life in 1880. Bedbugs in particular were extraordinarily difficult to eradicate. They lived in the seams of mattresses, in the joints of bed frames, in the cracks of plaster walls. Every housekeeping manual of the period has extensive sections dedicated to the war against insects, because it was a war, and it was never finally won. The second bedroom holds the children. There are 5 of them in this family, ranging in age from 3 to 14. They sleep in 2 beds, some sideways, some stacked together by size and warmth. The eldest daughter, at 14, has for the past year been sleeping in a truckle bed that rolls out from beneath the main bed each night and must be rolled back each morning. She does this without complaint, because complaint changes nothing. It is 6 o'clock. The house is stirring. The mother, let us call her by a common Victorian name, let us call her Eliza, has been up for 30 minutes. She is 34 years old and looks closer to 45. This is not a reflection of any failure on her part. It is simply what life does to women's bodies in 1880, when the average working-class woman's daily physical labor would exhaust a modern athlete trained for endurance. She has lit the range. She has put water on to boil. She has gone out to the privy in the cold dark and come back. She is now beginning to make the day's porridge.
The father, call him Thomas, rises at 6:30. He is a factory worker, employed at one of the large metalworking plants that have made the Midlands the forge of the world. He will walk to work because the penny for an omnibus fare cannot be spent carelessly. The walk is 40 minutes each way in any weather. He will arrive at the factory gate before the starting bell at 7:30 because lateness means a fine deducted from his wages, and a fine means someone goes hungry. Thomas sits down to his porridge and a cup of strong tea, heavily sweetened with sugar, because in 1880, sugar is one of the great consolations of working-class life, cheap enough to be available, but sweet enough to make an otherwise thin meal feel substantial. There is no bacon this morning. Bacon is for Sunday. There might be bread, if Eliza baked yesterday. There might be a scraping of dripping, the solidified fat collected from roasting meat, on the bread. It is, by modern nutritional standards, an almost completely inadequate breakfast. By the standards of 1880, it is perfectly ordinary. Thomas does not linger. He pulls on his jacket, his cap, his heavy boots. Boots that he himself has resoled twice because boot leather is expensive and you do not throw things away. And he is out the door before 7. He will not return until past 6 in the evening. He will have worked 11 hours on his feet in a factory that is loud enough to cause progressive hearing damage, hot enough in summer to produce heat stroke, and managed under a system of discipline that would today constitute workplace abuse. He earns roughly 25 shillings a week. It sounds like very little because it is very little. And everything, rent, food, clothing, coal, school fees for the children, occasional medicine, must come from it. Meanwhile, Eliza's morning has only just begun. After Thomas leaves, she turns her attention to the children. The 3 youngest must be dressed and fed. The eldest daughter, Mary, helps with this, because at 14 she is already essentially a second mother in the household. This is not unusual. In working-class Victorian families, the eldest daughter's childhood effectively ends somewhere around 11 or 12, when she becomes competent enough to take on meaningful domestic labour. She does not go to school anymore. She helps at home, and on 2 afternoons a week, she goes to work as a laundress's assistant for a neighbour, earning a few pennies that go directly to Eliza. The 2 middle children, boys aged 9 and 12, attend the local board school. The Education Act of 1870 established a national system of elementary schools across England, and by 1880, elementary education is compulsory up to the age of 10, with many attending until 12. School is not free. There is a small weekly fee, a few pennies, and shoes are required, which creates genuine hardship for families where children's feet are perpetually outgrowing their footwear. The boys' boots are second-hand, resoled by Thomas at the cobbling block in the yard on Sunday afternoons. They leave for school with slates and chalk and a lunch of bread wrapped in cloth. The school they attend is a large, high-ceilinged Victorian board school with rows of wooden desks, a master who keeps discipline with a cane, and a curriculum composed of reading, writing, arithmetic, and, for the girls in the girls' section, needlework and domestic science. The windows are large, Victorian educators believed, somewhat progressively, in natural light, but the heating is inadequate, and in January the children sit in their coats and the ink in the inkwells sometimes freezes.